Hello, fellow creative voyagers, and welcome to an in-between episode of the Indy Author Podcast. In episode 111, I spoke with Jeff Elkins, the dialogue doctor, about using engines, anchors, and hazards to define character voice. But after we wrapped up that conversation, Jeff was kind enough to keep recording to answer a question that I love to ask fellow podcasters. What was he getting from his podcast, both for himself and in terms of his goals related to helping other authors, that was different after over 70 episodes than he expected when he did episode 1? As is often the case when I speak with Jeff, he took that question in a truly wonderful direction. He talked about the importance to him of building community and how that differs from podcasters like me, whose primary goal is to provide content. And he illustrated the differences with examples of several other podcasters whose names I think you'll recognize. He talked about factoring in where your energy comes from in a way that's much more useful than the usual introvert-extrovert model. And he talked about how we can change the story we tell ourselves to achieve the results we're aiming for. And he offered some great insights about serving one's community while also enlisting the support of that community and keeping a creative endeavor going. This was such timely advice for me because I'd been agonizing for months over changes I wanted to make to my patronage program for the Indie Author. And I'll talk more about how I'm acting on Jeff's insights after the interview. But now let's dive into this in-between episode conversation with Jeff Elkins, the dialogue doctor. I always like to take advantage of speaking with another podcaster to talk about podcasting for authors. And so what episode are you up to on the Dialogue Doctor now?
Today I did 70.
And over how long a time? That's like a year and a half or something like that?
70 weeks.
70 weeks. There you go.
Every week for 70.
So I'm just curious as to what are you getting from the podcast, both for yourself and your goals related to helping other people, that is different at episode 70 than you thought it would be when you did episode 1?
So, man, that's a great question. I think there's 3 things podcasting for authors has given me. I think when I started podcasting, I thought I was going to be teaching people things, or at least curating things. Like, my job is to take these ideas and curate what's good and what's bad, or what's helpful and not helpful is probably a better way to say that. Or like my job is to come up with ideas and teach them. What I'm learning is that because podcasting is such an intimate connection with people, that what I'm actually doing is building a community that is going on a journey of learning together. So it's not actually my job to teach or to educate. It's my job to be authentic and real with what I'm learning and where I'm going, and then allowing other people to come on that journey with me. So that to say, what I've gotten out of podcasting for authors is I have a community of authors that I didn't have before. There's people that are on this journey with me. It's in the Slack group that we have going, but it's also people like you, people that I bring on all the time that I'm like, oh, we're watching your writing mature together. There's clients that I work with repeatedly where I'm like, okay, we're actually growing as writers together. I'm growing as an editor and a writer. You're growing as a writer. We're moving through this together. So I get that community, and then that personal growth of me also learning and growing as a writer. Currently rewriting the first novel I wrote because it's really special to me. And I'm realizing like, oh, after these 70 weeks of learning in this cohort that I facilitate through the podcast, I'm a radically different writer than when I wrote that book 7 years ago. I write dialogue differently. I think about characters differently. I just see characters differently. So the book is very different because of this cohort that I facilitate through the podcast.
So I have to ask, for selfish purposes, I've tried to create that kind of community through a Facebook group, not, I have to say, to huge success so far. So do you think that the Slack platform lends itself more to community building, or do you think that there's something independent of the technology that you feel is being successful to you in terms of building community?
Yes and yes. So at the moment, I think Slack lends more to community building. Slack and Discord seem to be the things of community building. What they're doing well is it is an isolated place that allows for instant communication. So the instant communication is important because I've been in groups that tried to build around like message board style, And those become more venting places where somebody vents and then doesn't ever return to like actually have conversation.
Mhm.
We, in our text message world, our expectation is immediate communication. So Slack and Discord have that down. Facebook does too, by the way. Immediate communication on Facebook happens as well. What Slack and Discord have over Facebook right now is that there is no algorithm behind Slack and Discord mediating what you see
Yeah. Yeah.
because you opt into the group. So when you opt into the group, you're just kind of in a room with all of these people.
Yep.
Whereas Facebook, you get community members in your group for Facebook, but Facebook is acting as a third party, deciding when those community members are actually, if at all, notified about what's happening in your group.
Yeah.
And so that's why I've actually left. I started on Facebook and I realized, like, oh, Facebook for me is really good for advertising. If I want to run an ad to people who may not know about me, Facebook is good for that. Facebook is bad for true relationship building. That being said, the relationship building that has really worked well for me is not just gathering people into a space to talk, but providing those people ways to connect. So I do at the Dialogue Doctor master classes, which are like, if you're in the Slack cohort, you get a discount on because I want to encourage those people to be there. Those are like 4.5 hours that we have together in a Zoom room. Those are really important for relationship building. For the Slack group, I do a once a month Zoom call where like we get on a Zoom call with a short story and we diagnose it together. And most of the time, that's just me being like, so how did y'all feel about that? And that hourly interaction once a month, usually those go about 2 hours. That 2 hours of interaction once a month is actually what builds the relationship. Another person doing this really well is Jay Thorne, has the Author Success Mastermind,
Mhm.
which has a Slack group to it, has a really strong connection between the group members there. And he does a monthly town hall where they come on and they literally just talk about what's happening in their lives. And sometimes they tackle a question. The key, though, is to see yourself as a facilitator of that cohort and then provide ways for the cohort to connect with one another. And that's how the community has built for me, is being like, okay, I need to find something for us to connect around. So for Jay's, it's questions about publishing, questions about indie life, questions about writing. It's a more general connection. Mine is very specifically craft. Like we get on and we're talking about craft questions. I try to find interesting things for them to do. Like I put out a writing prompt every Tuesday and everybody posts their work and we comment on the work together. Part of that is me facilitating opportunities for us to be on this learning journey together.
That's very interesting. And I think one thing it's making me think of is that I've tried different approaches to my Patreon setup. And for a while, I was encouraged by the guidance that Patreon provides to have different tiers of membership with different stuff. And I finally thought earlier this year, I offered 2 levels, but I said, basically, it's all the same stuff because I kind of don't like the idea of withholding some information artificially. So for a while, what I was doing is I was providing members at a certain membership level with either outtakes or extra material from the recording. But it always felt creepy to me to withhold that, which was good information from some of the listeners. And so I finally just said, look, if you support me, you get the same thing. It's just, make the decision based on the value you're getting and what you can afford and all that. And I didn't see any downtick in people signing up, but I didn't see any uptick either. But one of the things I'm thinking of is that something like access to a group, I think is a legitimate thing that you can use as an offering to people who support you at a higher level. It's feeling different to me somehow, I guess, because it's something that by its definition is more valuable the more restricted it is. So a Slack group with, let's say, 100 people is, I think, a more interesting place to be than a Slack channel with 1,000 people because the group becomes more intimate. So I feel better about restricting that to a certain level of community than
Yeah.
I did before.
We talk about Patreon and the tier level and that kind of stuff. I think you have to make a choice between are you a content provider or a community builder?
Yeah.
Because they're two different things,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm part of Joanna Penn's Patreon. Joanna interacts with the Patreon, but she is a content provider at the highest level, right? Like that's not a downplay. That's like
Yeah.
she is providing futurist thought. She's providing news and resources. She's providing this amazing content that helps me be a better writer. I don't have an expectation from her that she is going to build a community. Now, I'm part of her community, but it's not an interactive thing where I expect her to hang out with me. I
Yeah.
come from a community organizing background. I
Mhm.
worked in nonprofits for 15 years. For me, the group is the point. That is the point.
Mhm.
Building the community is the point. So for me, Patreon is just a vehicle to provide a gate for people to get into the community. But I'm thinking about the community. The difference between the two is if you're thinking from a content provider direction, where you're like, I'm going to set up my content provider for tiers, Patreon's right. Set up tiers, make sure all three tiers are super easy for you to provide, like
Yeah.
that you can almost knock out all three tiers at once. And then offer a low, medium, and high because people are unlikely to grab the high. If they see a medium, they'll get the medium. So you actually want them to buy the medium, right? Like, so that's why Patreon's like, you need tiers because people are going to look at it and they're going to be like, oh, well, I don't want to just be at the low level. But that top one, that's really expensive. I'll get the one below it. Like, it's just
Yeah.
gaming how people think about prices. So if you're a content provider, understanding that you're not withholding things from people, what you offer is worth it in itself and got them to come to your Patreon in the first place. And these bonuses you're offering is about them choosing their level of engagement with the content you're providing. So I wouldn't think of it as like you're withholding anything from anybody. They're making choices as to how active they want to be with the content you're providing. And that's the content provider side. For me, though, on the community builder side, it costs $1 a month to get into my community. That's it. Because I want as many people in that community as possible, because I know as a business, Slack people don't listen to this. As a business, I know that Dialogue Doctor is going to be funded and run by the people in the community because I'm building a community of people that love this community and want this community to continue. So they are going to fund a Dialogue Doctor to continue. Like I came from church building world. That's how you build a church. You get a bunch of people in a room. You're like, hey, we're all in this together. Don't you love it? Awesome. We have to tithe to keep this going. And that's what the Dialogue Doctor community is. We're not a church. We're an organization of people obsessed about craft. We're all obsessed about craft. We want to keep working on craft. And you got to know that you're going to have to pay a little bit to keep this community going.
Yeah.
So people accept that kind of club mentality because it's something we're used to.
Can I ask you a question about that before you go on? And that is that I'm starting to think a little bit about the way you just described the Dialogue Doctor community. It sounds a little bit like StoryGrid. Did you follow the
I
StoryGrid
did follow StoryGrid.
podcast? And so it started out with basically
Yeah.
Sean Coyne, who's the originator of StoryGrid, and Tim Grahl, the two of
Yep.
them talking. And now it's like an industry.
Yeah. So when they started their certification process, they started building a community. They're like, if you're a StoryGrid editor, you're part of this elite community of people. And we're going to bring you on to talk about things and we're going to include you in, and you get benefits as a StoryGrid editor being part of it. Now, I would say the difference between what I'm doing is that my gate is very easy to get through. Their
Right.
gate is very difficult and selective. And that is an example of people who are doing community over content. They're not cranking out 1,000 new StoryGrid books. They're not content providers. They're community having a conversation around a piece of content. So that's a good observation. And I would say for podcasters who are like deciding, again, like take my words as a grain of salt, because I've been in this for 70 weeks. It's probably better to talk to like Sasha Black or Joanna Penn about this, who've been going forever. I would say pick one or the other.
Yeah.
You can't do both. I mean, you can do both if you're superhuman, but the community takes a lot of work to build and keep going. Generating constant new content that keeps people engaged takes a lot of work. You will have both. If you go content provider, a community will form around it. Like I said, I formed around Joanna Penn. Like I listened to
Yeah.
all of her stuff. I consider myself part of her community, even though she's not doing the activity of community building. She's providing new content. There is a community that's formed around her.
I think that's an excellent distinction. And I can see that I'm definitely building a community as secondary to
Yeah,
providing
content.
content.
Yeah,
Take it
it's
off.
one of the reasons your Facebook page hasn't taken off, right? Like,
Yeah.
but Sasha Black is a natural community builder.
Yep.
She draws people into her brand and into her story in a very dramatic way. She provides people to participate, like on her Facebook group every Monday. She's very vulnerable and open about, like, hey, here are my goals for the week. Here's what I accomplished last week, and here are my goals for this week. And then she says, everybody share your goals here. And she's got active questions and things happening. She has a Slack group as well that is the most active Slack group I've ever seen. It's crazy. Now she's also providing content. She's doing both, but man, her community building is on point.
And I think it's even interesting that oftentimes her content is driven by what her community is asking for. So I interviewed Sasha. Episode 91 was creating stellar side characters with Sasha Black, which is, when her side character book came out. And I believe that she picked that as the topic because her community voted for that as the topic that they most wanted to hear her perspective on.
There's really been a community formed around dialogue. And I now kind of think of the work of Dialogue Doctor as really the work of the community that has come around it. Because some of the people in the community, we've been walking and learning together now for a year and a half since Dialogue Doctor started. So we have a Slack group together and we're on Zoom calls once a month. And I'm always talking about new ideas with them, and they're evaluating and sharing their thoughts on those new ideas. And that's part of where the concept that we're going to talk about today of vehicles, engines, anchors, and hazards came from, was having conversations with them and working on their work with them and looking at their stuff is like, oh, this is a problem we're having that we kind of need to solve with characterization and dialogue and how characters operate within a narrative. So yeah, that's why I use the we, because it's not just, I feel like the Dialogue Doctor isn't just me on a podcast anymore. There's actually like a group of us that are kind of putting it together.
You have a whole practice now. It's not a single doctor, it's a practice.
I call them a cohort. I have a cohort, a dialogue cohort we're all on this journey together.
It's sort of back to the definition of introvert and extrovert is extroverts get their energy from interacting with people. Introverts get their energy by not interacting with people. I'm not expressing that very well, but the whole idea of that kind of community interaction to build that community sounds as exhausting to me, which is why I think I'm more of a content person.
Yeah. And I am an introvert. Like if you get me in a room of people, I have about an hour before I'm like, I need space. But I also love people. So I think part of it is like, what makes you feel like you're wearing a medal? As opposed to where your energy comes from, I'd encourage you to think about like, where are you going to feel most successful? So an hour Zoom call with my community super drains me and I have to go straight to bed after I'm done. At the same time, I feel amazing hanging out with those people.
Yeah.
And so there is that balance of, is it going to drain you? But also like, my dog does certain behaviors because I give him treats for doing those behaviors. And I'm the same way. I keep holding Zoom calls and keep showing up to my community because it feels great to be with those people. And so I get that little treat when I do it. I want to do it again.
Yeah.
If you get a treat out of putting amazing content into the world, putting content in the world stresses me out. Like when I put the Dialogue Daisy out and people love that piece of content, but man, I agonized over that for a month before I told anybody about it because I was so stressed that I was wrong.
Yeah.
Right. Or the tools that I build, I sit there and stress out about them forever because I'm so afraid that, no, this is just Jeff being weird in his own head. So I couldn't be a content provider. And I do provide a lot of content. I put a lot of content into the world, but that's not my focus.
Yeah.
My focus is building the community because building the community makes me feel good. Whereas building the content stresses me out. So that's how I made the decision is like, when I accomplish something, what makes me feel good? The Dialogue Daisy felt great to me after people started using it and they were like, this is helpful. That's was like, oh, awesome. That makes me feel good. But just putting it into the world, I was like, oh my gosh, this is super stressful. I don't ever want to put anything out again. It's one of the reasons I've struggled to write a book because, well, one, I couldn't figure out what the book was about. But now that I know what the book is about, I really have to focus on, I'm putting a book out because people want it and have asked for it.
Yeah.
Because for me, the treat comes from helping other people, not putting the content into the world. I don't care about the content. Like for me, it's like, oh, this is going to help you. Then yes, I want to do this thing. So I think part of it is about figuring out like what's triggering that treat.
Yeah. And for me, when I put content out, I'm like, this is so cool. And then when I start getting responses, it's like, oh, there's an extra I didn't even think about. Yeah, it is very interesting, those differences, and then how it plays out in terms of community building, as you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's all just like, sometimes I feel like we're just rearranging words to justify, to trick ourselves into doing things, right? Like that's all we're doing. We're just rearranging the story we tell ourselves in order to get the desired result we want. And so the question is like, what's the best story to tell yourself to motivate what you need to do? I have to tell myself that this is helping people in order to actually do it. But if you have to tell yourself that you're adding to the wealth of knowledge in the world, then tell yourself that story. Like,
Yeah.
whatever story is gonna motivate you to work. Yeah. Tell yourself that story. Yeah.
And I guess if you have to talk yourself into either one of those, maybe that's the wrong path, but there's probably one of those that immediately resonates with you and one where you go, huh. And
yeah, if you're having to tell the story really hard and your body's like, I don't care, then yeah, seriously. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, when we started out, you said there were 3 things that you had learned that were different. Have we covered 3 of them in that conversation, or did we only pick one?
Probably.
Okay.
I'm learning things. Community building is critically important. The third other one kind of goes in that community building, which we have covered, which is understanding that I'm motivated by helping others. So just knowing that that really determines what I put on the podcast and what I don't put on the podcast. I get a lot of requests for interviews. I mean, we all do. I think once you get over like 30 episodes, people start to email you. I get once a week, I get somebody that's like, hey, can I be on your podcast? And part of me is like, I'd really like to help you, but that's not how I'm helping my community. Like my community has, and so I'll ask the community all the time. I'll be like, hey, do you guys want me to start doing interviews? I get a lot of requests and I could really be helping people by interviewing them. Like they want to show off their stuff. I want to help them show off their stuff. But my community has said like, no, if we want interviews, we go listen to Joanna. We don't need to listen to you. So it's like, oh, so this isn't helpful. So this isn't something I'm going to do. Yeah. So part of the way I gauge what I do on my podcast is what is my community finding the most helpful? And that's where I'm like, okay, I'll do that thing. Yeah.
Well, and I'll just be what's the opposite of altruistic. I'll be the selfish representative here, that almost all my podcast interviews are triggered by me saying, I really want to talk to X more about Y. Like I heard your talk about vehicles, engines, anchors, and hazards at Jay and Zach's Career Author Summit.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I want to talk about that more with them. And as an added extra bonus, other people will be able to hear it too. So.
Yeah. And again, you're just telling yourself the story like that you need to tell yourself in order to get it done. Right. Like that's the key, is that self-manipulation in order to. Yeah.
Well, self-manipulation, or I'm going to go back to listening to what your natural inclination is.
That's a nice
and capitalizing on that, and maybe not trying to force yourself. Like I'm realizing that I'm kind of forcing myself into a community building effort that isn't the thing that's giving me energy or making me feel like I'm getting a medal.
Yeah. And that's the question, like, your original question about Facebook. The question is like, is Facebook the problem, or is it that community building is a chore?
Right. And it also varies between fiction and nonfiction, because I also have a private Facebook group that's more for my fiction. I would never move it off anywhere other than Facebook, because it's mainly people posting cute pictures of their pets, I have to say, which we're all having a good time with. And I'm like, that's fine. I'm having fun there.
Yeah. Chris, where people are having a good time. Yeah.
Yeah. But, very interesting. Well, thank you. Thank you. I can see this as being like a whole little in-between episode or something like that. No, so
I'm all for whatever.
Well, thank you for indulging me for an extra little shot of content there. And
absolutely.
I think community building.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope you loved what Jeff had to say as much as I did. I loved when he talked about how you can identify if you're a community builder or a content provider by asking yourself, what makes you feel like you're wearing a medal? Sharing his perspective as a community building podcaster, I loved his comment that it's my job to be authentic and real with what I'm learning and where I'm going, and then allowing other people to come on that journey with me. The key is to see yourself as a facilitator of that cohort and then provide ways for that cohort to connect with one another. Right now, I see myself as being squarely in the content provider camp, but I also agreed with Jeff's comment that if you go content provider, a community will form around it. Taking all this into account, I finally succeeded in coming up with a plan for my patronage program that I feel best serves my community and my efforts to keep the indie author afloat. First, how could I provide a platform for building community among my patrons? I was intrigued by Jeff's conversation about what Slack had to offer, so I joined Jeff's Slack community, as well as Sasha Black's, to see how the experts were managing it. Then I created my own Slack space, the Indie Author Crew, for patrons and for past podcast guests, and I have to say I'm enjoying Slack much more than I expected. I'm also gratified to see that even in the relatively small current Indie Author Shakedown Crew Slack space, there's already starting to be some interactions not only between me and the members, but also among the members, which is fantastic. I also like Jeff's advice about providing some differentiation among 3 patronage tiers. So here's what I came up with. I'm going to be offering a $1 per month, $3 per month, and $5 per month level. And all of them will include early access to the interview videos on YouTube, an on-air thank you on the podcast, and inclusion in a patron list at theindieauthor.com, along with a link to the patron's website. The second benefit is membership in the Indie Author Slack community. And currently, if you're a member at any level, you have access to the Indie Author Crew Slack space, and I plan to continue this approach for a little while. However, I'll probably be moving to having the Slack membership as a benefit to those at the middle and higher tier memberships. But once you're in the Slack space, you're grandfathered in regardless of your patronage level. So perhaps that will be an incentive for you to take the plunge with a $1 per month patronage level now. And then for the highest level tier, I would include ebooks of Taking the Short Tack, the book I co-wrote with Mark Leslie Lefebvre about creating income and connecting with readers using short fiction, and the Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, plus any future nonfiction books I publish if the patron is active at the time of the launch. There are still a couple of options that I'm pondering, and I would love your input on these. First of all, would you be interested in having a monthly Zoom call with me and fellow patrons on topics related to the writing craft and the publishing voyage? This would probably be a benefit for mid and high tier members, at least initially. I'd love suggestions for nautically themed names for each of the tiers, the $1, $3, and $5 per month tiers. I would love to hear any input you have on my updated patronage program. To leave a comment, you can go to theindieauthor.com/podcast and click on In Between Episode 116. You can also leave a comment if you're watching this on YouTube, or send me comments at maddie@maddiedalrymple.com, and that's Maddie with a Y. To review the options or to support me on Patreon, please go to theindieauthor.com/Patreon. And as always, you can still use the Buy Me a Coffee link if you'd like to make an occasional contribution to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage. And you can find the Buy Me a Coffee link at the bottom of any page at theindieauthor.com. In addition to any input you may have on the Indie Author Patronage Program, I'd also love to hear any thoughts you have in general about the insights and advice that Jeff shared. And if you loved what he had to say as much as I did, I hope you'll check out Jeff's patronage program at patreon.com/Jeff Elkins. And perhaps I'll see you in the Dialogue Doctor Slack space.